Last week, we have already learned that this is our basic literature, the management control systems by Merchant and van der Stede. And I want you to keep that in mind, just in case the slides are not enough for you, for your homework, or you want to deepen your knowledge, then please go ahead and have a look at that book. That's more or less our main literature for the course. Okay, then let me start with our last slide that we have had last time. Okay, let me ask once more. You can all see the screen, right? So this was the last slide that we actually worked on in last session. Most important is goal congruence, that all goals ought to be aligned, all organizational goals, and with that, all the employee behavior. They all got to be also aligned with all the organizational goals, that people, employees behave in the way the organization, in the way that the organization plans their goals, and be able to achieve those goals. For that, we also need employee motivation. We have formal as well as informal control mechanisms that we can apply, and we can sort of control behavior and also risk to achieve those goals by spreading goals throughout the system. Let's say more than one department, that we interlink certain goals and therefore certain mechanisms for goals that are not just linked to one department, but maybe to 2 or 3 departments, and thereby spread the risk. Okay, then we continue today with an important slide, namely the levels of control. And I want for you to write that down as one framework. Siemens, 1995, created the levels of control, and this is one management control systems framework that we also work with. However, and that's important to say, this is not the actual framework of the basic literature. We stick very much onto Merchant and van der Stede, and we'll explain that later on. However, please note that this is also an important additional framework, so to speak. And I'm introducing this now already because this framework seems to be rather on a meta level. It governs control mechanism that are more abstract, more strategic, let's say. And we have certain phenomena. Any of the control mechanisms can be formal or informal, which means we have formal control mechanisms, for example, a code of conduct or your job description, but we also have informal control mechanisms like perhaps authority of management, the way management talks with the employees, or sharing information via having a cup of coffee during the break. That would be more or less a more informal control. If we as an organization were capable of using informal control to talk to people, I think we would be able to manage quite a bit more and much better than just using formal controls, because anything can be written on a job description and anything can be written in a code of conduct, like you should be on time, or like integrity or loyalty. Those could be aspects of a code of conduct. However, while they are formalized, it doesn't really mean that people live that. But when we address them informally, there is a power to that informal conversation, to the informal communication. And so therefore, if we were able to use that as a control mechanism, we could quickly target organizational issues, and we should actually keep that in mind, that we can use that just as much informally as a control mechanism. That's the one part. All of the levels of control, and we have 4 that are right in front of you, namely the belief system, the boundary system, the diagnostic control system, and the interactive control system. These 4 systems are called the levers of control. And all of those can be either formal or informal. Like a belief system, this is more like a cultural control aspect. What do we believe in as an organization? What are our norms, our values, the philosophy behind things that we are doing, or our goals, our achievements? This can be formally introduced, let's say, in a mission statement, where, let's say, the philosophy is maybe displayed, but it also can be very much informal because we live a certain organizational culture in our organization. And due to that lively act, it becomes very much informal. However, it's still a control mechanism. Boundary system, another level of control, focuses on the boundaries. What is accepted in our organization and what is not accepted. What can be done, what cannot be done. So in a sense, also our contingencies. Contingencies, we have external contingencies and internal contingencies. External contingencies could be, for example, laws and regulations, the environmental situation, also the sociological impact or situation, the technological or innovative situation at a given time. Those are external boundaries, so to speak. Human capital. Not every country has the same minds or the same quality of universities and so on. So therefore we have boundaries of, for example, human capital, of knowledge. And those are external contingencies. Internal contingencies would be, well, which kind of technology do we use? What can we afford to actually invest in? Who do we hire? And because of the human capital or intellectual capital of the people that we hire, well, those are now our boundaries. We don't have anyone smarter, but the people that we hire in that aspect. Okay, so we have a boundary system in the sense of contingencies that we also are able to use as a control systems, namely precisely in the aspect what is tolerated, what is accepted in our company and what is not. This can be done formally, like in a code of conduct, you must be on time, and if you are 5 minutes late, then that is a boundary. You will be reprimanded, for example. Or it can be, and mostly also done informally, that we informally know our boundaries within our society, within our organization, within our department, within our team. Okay, another level of control is the diagnostic control system. And as the name already says, it's diagnostic, which means it's like the processes in the organization are diagnosable. And that means they are forecastable. We already know those processes. That's why we can diagnose them. We can see the efficiency or the inefficiency of certain processes and adjust those because we can diagnose the processes. We have a certain computer system or a certain process of doing things, and because of that, we can diagnose what we need to adjust, how to improve things, and that's precisely targeted with the diagnostic control systems. In that aspect, this is also rather for a very stable environment, which means stable environment because we have routinized processes. Those are standardized processes, so to speak. And this is in opposite or versus the interactive control system, as in this case, the last level of control. The interactive control system needs to be used more or less for a changing environment. When we have organizational change, when suddenly the environment, the business environment, the competition and so on changes, we may lose market share, we may gain market share, situations change, and for that, processes don't become anymore as standardized or as diagnosable, and we have to interact, which means we have to interact from department to department. Management has to go, top management, let's say, has to get a level down and talk to lower management or all sorts of employees to get to know the changing processes and how are we going to change now these different processes. And thereby, top management interacts with, needless to say, the entire organization, with all sorts of employees and management. And even that interaction can be a control mechanism, if we are aware of it. So this interactive control system versus the diagnostic control system is more or less for a changing environment, which is pretty much constant nowadays. And needless to say, at least studies show that when we talk about the belief system in regard to the interactive control system, that this is more or less positively felt by employees and by management, and that therefore this is more a positive control system, because the belief system, the culture, also opens up that we communicate, that we interact, we get a much higher dynamic going in the organization, and that's why it's good. It's felt rather positively. On the contrary, a boundary system going along with a diagnostic control system is actually felt rather negatively. So this would be more or less a negative control system, because not everyone likes boundaries. And even standardized processes can be, to a certain degree, pretty boring. Everything is so normed, everything is so standardized, so routinized. There's no room for freedom, there's no room for creativity, for innovation, and therefore this may actually even hinder certain processes to come alive because of such a strict boundary system and a diagnostic control system. Okay, I hope I explained this reasonably enough for you to gather, for you to understand. These are the levels of control by Simmons, and these are a meta control mechanism. We thereafter focus more on the operationalizing management control systems, and in that sense, we can use the levels of control that guide us strategically, so to speak. Okay. What's the functional benefit? Well, needless to say, to actually get done what management wants to get done, which means management control systems should be influence the behavior, control. In the best way, it should motivate employees to behave in the way that management wants employees to behave, which means towards organizational objectives. When we speak of management control systems, Merchant and van der Stede detected three basic problems or categories of problems. and namely lack of direction, lack of motivation, and personal limitation. And the lack of direction, for example, is actually pretty vital because it happens, frankly, all the time. That management will ask employees to do something without actually a proper guidance. Employees do not have the all-around information to know why they are doing certain things or why they are following a certain result or a certain goal, because they don't understand it, because that message never reached the employee, so to speak. It happens that management sometimes they don't know themselves. If you would ask them actually, why are we doing things, then they may be not clueless, but they may be actually stumbling over the same question. Which means a lack of direction is actually pretty frequent, unfortunately. When employees are given goals and a way to behave, but they are not sure why they do things or what it is all about, or maybe those goals are not even smart, which means they're not very specific, they're not measurable perhaps. Maybe they're not even achievable or relevant or realistic, or maybe even timely. Maybe they're not timely. Timely, for example, I'd like you to do that within the next month, and next month I'll check it. And if they don't have that direction, they may do it in 2 months because they didn't know. And if they have an inspecific goal, they may actually perform, but however, it was pretty inspecific and management is still not happy. However, they didn't specify what exactly they needed. So lack of direction is a pretty a big issue in the corporate world, in any business world, and is one main problem that we target with management control systems. Lack of motivation, go figure, is another one, which means that maybe due to lack of the direction, it turns into a lack of motivation. This could be due to bad leadership. Employees are demotivated because they didn't get a clear goal, they didn't really know what to do, and it naturally demotivates them. Another reason, however, would also be that they behave out of self-interest. And that will mean that they maybe make more coffee breaks or cigarette breaks than they're supposed to. Maybe they manipulate data to look better, to have a better image in the company, while the actual behavior or the actual numbers or goals are actually not quite as successful or pleasant, let's say. Maybe they're more sick than they're supposed to be because they are not motivated. Maybe they even turn into or create criminal acts because they think the company, they have all the money and they don't get enough salary or whatever wages, and they manipulate the company either in a financial aspect or even steal or whatever. So even that can be part of a lack of motivation, which is yet another problem of management that is targeted by management control systems. And the last main category of problems is personal limitation, which means that if we as managers accidentally hire people who do not have the skills, if we recruit the wrong people, then this may also be a part of a personal limitation because they don't have the competences. They don't have the training or the work experience. They may have had a great CV. We recruited them because we thought they would fit into our organization because we thought they had the skills or something like that. Well, when in fact it shows that they actually don't. Um, Personal limitations. So it's actually a limitation of human capital, a limitation of intellectual capital. And that is yet just another problem that is targeted with management control systems. Needless to say, we don't want to achieve perfect control, that we have optimal control. So this is actually our focus, our main target that we want to achieve. However, management controls do not always involve a simple cybernetic system, which means it's not always as straightforward, it's not always as easy, countable, and that's why we first need to actually detect our problems, our issues, which means we measure, we control, what's actually, did we reach the goals or not? We have to assess, assess in that aspect, did we reach the goals or not? What are actually the problems? Was the problem, for example, a lack of direction and that the employees didn't really know what they are aiming for? Or was it perhaps lack of motivation and I have recruited some people who actually are not really motivated for some reason? Or is it just a matter of competences and skills? So I have to assess that. And then we have an effector function, which means that naturally we have to take action, and management control systems covers those aspects. We measure, we compare, decide for a standard, and naturally take corrective actions. Direct supervision, for example, would be one aspect in how to observe, in how to control employee behavior. Also, of course, we need to perhaps focus on hiring standards, on what's been written on a code of conduct. Does that still suit us? But a rather a proactive way would be that we make sense out of our problems, like a lack of direction, lack of motivation, and personal limitation, and try to get an answer there. Which parts are on the employee behavior? Which parts are missing? Do we need to add competencies? Do we need to perhaps train our people? Or do we need to question them why they are demotivated or why they behave in a certain way? Or perhaps do we need to specify much more our goals? In that aspect, we dive literally right into management control systems, and we will talk about the framework of Merchant and van der Stede, which is our main framework for the course, which is result controls as a performance measurement control, action controls, personal cultural controls, and also the tightness of controls. So whenever I use controls, how tight how tight should I apply the control mechanism? Now, technically, I have a couple of choices. If I have problems, control problems, issues, then I can avoid them very quickly by standardized processes, by automizing processes, which means I invest in technology, which means I don't need human labor anymore, but some sort of a computer system or a machine does the job now. And wherever I am able, as a manager, wherever I'm able to automate, I will reduce automatically the risk of having certain problems like a lack of direction, lack of motivation, or personal limitation. However, there are still in any organization numerous processes where we cannot just automate those, like customer service, for example, or sales, where we need employees, we need human capital or human resources, so to speak. And for those, we then apply management control systems, and namely those four we already have mentioned based on Merchant and van der Stede. Managers have to consider the balance of costs and benefits. What is particularly meant by that is that when we invest in technology, in, for example, standardization or automation, that costs a lot. And we need to outweigh or weigh the cost benefit factor. Is it cheaper to keep a couple of people on staff that may make mistakes or may make an error? However, I can some sort with management control systems correct these errors or adjust employee behavior. Is that still cheaper than investing in a machine or in a computer system and so on? Or is it the other way around? So cost benefit factor will always have to be considered when we talk about management control systems as well. And those are the four control systems again that we will cover in this course. Result controls as clear output controls. We talk about any different given results. Actions that targets the behavior of employees. Personal controls, which means how can I actually control my all of my employees in a sense of knowledge, in a sense of human resources, training skills, competencies, and cultural controls is one more control. How to control, in a sense, organizational culture. Okay. In addition to the framework by Merchant and van der Stede, those four controls, Malmy and Brown offered these management control systems as a package. And that's actually the key word, as a package. They also found in the very top cultural controls, which governs plans, values, norms, beliefs, right? But also symbols. So it also it's part of the organizational identity. Then a step down or a bit below, we have planning controls, cybernetic controls, which is close to result controls, like having a budget, financial and non-financial measurements. To the right, a reward and compensation. Also, this can be a control mechanism if we set incentives. And on the very bottom, we have administrative controls that talk about governance, corporate governance, so the organizational structure, and along the structure, all their policies and procedures. This also has a lot to do with a boundary system, for example. What are the organizational boundaries, the structures? I'm showing you this slide or this framework, management control systems, as a package to inform you that any of the controls, let's focus on those four, our main framework, result controls, action controls, personal and cultural controls. All of these controls, even before that, the levels of controls by Siemens, they all can be viewed as a package because somehow they all intertwined, they interlink. The one control mechanism triggers the other. So that's why Malmy and Brown found that they all interlink somehow, and that we need to treat the control mechanisms as a package. And by doing so, I would like for you to know that whenever we talk about any of the controls, whenever you do case studies for your homework or case studies also for the final exam, that you view the controls as a package, which means literally don't just treat one control or mention one control because it naturally interlinks with other controls that also need to be mentioned and need to be thought of. And that's, I think, the main information or the main focus. Treat any of the management control systems as a package. Okay, and then we should have our first in-class exercise. And what I will do in this case, I will read with you this case study, and I will answer this case study instead of you or for you, which means we're not interacting here at this point, because I think that would be pointless. However, we will have on our slides another case study, and we are coming to that later. And I will like to give that. I would like to give that to you as an additional homework, so you don't have to really now interact and think right away, but then perform by having one more homework, and it's in a sense it's pretty much the same deal. So let's go through that exercise. Wong's Pharmacy. Thomas Wong was the owner of Wong's Pharmacy, a small single-location drugstore. The store was founded by Thomas's father, and it had operated in the same location for 30 years. All of the employees are family members, hard workers, and Thomas could trust them. Although the store thrived in the early years, performance in the last years had not been good. Sales and profits were declining, and the problem was getting worse. The performance problems seem to have begun approximately at the same time when a large drugstore chain opened a branch 2 blocks away. Now, that's the case. A successful, small, family-sized pharmacy, local pharmacy, is losing sales and therefore market share because, or probably because of the large drugstore chain that opened up a couple of blocks away. The question is what to do. This situation is not unorthodox. However, we can target that phenomena also in the aspect of management control systems. The question would be, what could be the problems or the issues? And yes, we could say, wow, the problem is that they are losing market share, that the business is not doing so well anymore, so they're losing profits. They may have to lay off people. Maybe they don't have enough customers, or maybe their customers are not loyal anymore. Those are all problems, and granted, those are the problems. However, in the aspect when we target the issue at stake in light of management control systems, then based on Merchant and van der Stede, we actually can trickle those down and categorize them to the same old problems that we already have discussed, namely lack of direction, lack of motivation, and personal limitation. So for Merchant and van der Stede, there is not really a reason why, just because a large drugstore opens up a couple of blocks away, that the Wong's Pharmacy must lose business. In any case, based on Simmons's framework, they probably didn't use the interactive control systems where they literally interacted, maybe involved customers. What do they need to change in order to perform better, in order to keep loyal customers, in order to have and continue to have a unique selling point? So to answer number one, what could be the problems? We are limited to the 3 problems: lack of direction, lack of motivation, personal limitation. What has been changing for Thomas since the large drugstore opened? Those would be categorized now under all sorts of different issues, like losing market share, losing customers, losing profit, and so on. What does Thomas have to control, and how could he act and react? And now that's particularly the question. We view management control systems as a package, and therefore we ought to answer that question in light of controls as a package. What does Thomas have to control? He would have to make sure that his staff, they're all family members, that they actually have the competencies, that they need the competencies to inform customers qualified about different drugs, about different sicknesses, about different, maybe even homeopathic medicine or any other treatment. Maybe those family members for the last 30 years didn't have schooling anymore. Maybe they're not anymore up to date. So we got to make sure to bring them up to date, to give them the competences and the skills to create or have a good service for the customers. So that would be in the aspect of personal controls, for example. Action controls can be also very important in this aspect because Wong's pharmacy is entirely staffed with family members, and therefore maybe not through hires, not through professionals, but just rather family members. Some may have a bad attitude and are not necessarily motivated, while others do a fine job. Thomas would have to control or assess, in a sense, whether all family members are actually motivated, whether all family members behave in a customer-oriented and in a business-oriented way. So not only that they have the competences and the training, but also, let's say a customer complains, do they have a complaint management? Do they have the skills to treat customers that complain with a certain courtesy and be able to solve that problem, for example? So what actions do the family members do in their regular business, daily business, that either is suitable or is not suitable? Maybe we need to make some family members accountable, which means also responsible for something. Hey, if this and this happens, you are responsible. This is the way you treat people. This is our code of conduct. For example, we can formalize that. In this case, as a family member business, you probably informally work your way through. Right. So spreading responsibility, accountability in this aspect. Also, that perhaps not every family member should have access to all of the medicine, so they can do something harmful. Only knowledgeable staff, knowledgeable family members should have, for example, access to certain medicines or pills, or maybe only one particular family member or a new hire in this case treats customers in a homeopathic way, right? So here those action controls, in a sense, could be reevaluated by Thomas. And this also, we also target here whether we are going to stay with family members and just family members, or whether we will actually exchange and have new hires to change the atmosphere and the business, the business image, so to speak. Another control aspect would be, of course, result controls, output control. Does Thomas, in the aspect of lack of direction, did Thomas clearly say how much profit do we need to make? How much revenue do we need to make every single day? What are our costs? How do we need to reduce costs? How do we purchase? Maybe Thomas has a lot on inventory. For example, there is a lot of money involved. However, they don't even have that output. And needless to say, this is also influencing the profits. So also result controls, the way that Thomas leads his organization and the staff can be an aspect here and can be questioned. At last, also we have cultural controls, and here that's a big question, especially for a family business. All family businesses have their own culture. They have their own family developed culture. And the question is if that particular culture that has been active for the last 30 years, if that is still actually a culture that works in our society. So Thomas could or should rethink also the organizational culture. Maybe we need to have a facelifting, so to speak. We need to have different beliefs, different norms that we work with. We need to be more dynamic and we need to create this dynamic. We need to build dynamic, so to speak, be more innovative, more creative, maybe create a fun atmosphere. And thereby, talking about organizational culture, maybe creating also some USPs that are particularly great at Wong's Pharmacy and nowhere else. And this has also something to do with organizational culture. So here you can find in this small little case study, you can interpret, let's say, you can interpret a lot of different control mechanisms that you could apply. And at this point, for this case study, yes, it's very hypothetical, if and whens and whatever. But however, this gets to show, hopefully, this gets to show you how you can interpret management control systems, how you can use management control systems to find control mechanisms for your employees to hopefully stay in a successful business. A last question, or how could he positively influence his business situation? Well, that is just as much by applying those management control systems, changing a culture, educating staff, finding a unique selling points, involving customers perhaps. Those were aspects. Compare with Siemens, the levels of controls. I'm going to skip that today because I think that will actually, that's already a bit too much and not necessary. I did make the link to interactive control systems. I think that's more. That was a brief case study. And I hope I got the message across how to treat different situations, or in this case, that particular situation in perspective of management control systems. We have one more phenomenon when we talk about management control systems, and that is tightness. And tightness is in that sense, when we use control mechanisms, how tight do they have to be, or how leisure, how open, how freely how much freedom can you allow when applying control mechanisms. This also gets to show you that while it's called a control system, it doesn't have to be perfect, which a tightness suggests a perfect control. However, the question is if that's always perfect just because it's tight. So we apply different controls and we want to control different behavior and different situations. But the question is how much, what's the optimal control? And sometimes certain procedures, certain behaviors, certain employees, they need a bit tighter controls than others. And that's, in a sense, what we'll also discuss when we talk about the four control mechanism: result controls, action controls, personal and cultural controls. Okay, we start with result controls, and as the name already says, results, we are targeting control mechanisms that target or cover results, which means results can be anything where we have, as managers, where we have clear goals, clear targets, where there's supposed to be a result in the end of a task, in the end of a process. Anything that has an output, that has a result, would be covered within result controls, which means that can be financial, like any of the financial benchmarks or measurements, but it can also be non-financial, like employee fluctuation. We reduced our employee fluctuation by 50%. That would be a result. We increased customer satisfaction to 95%. That would also be a result, and many more. Especially nowadays in the aspect of sustainability, we standards, so to speak, have created numerous indicators that are non-financial. And I suspect that any of the financial measures you are aware of most of, or of quite a few of them anyway, based on accounting, cost accounting, or cost management, for example. Okay. So that all is covered within result controls, financial and non-financial measurements. And now, what's the control aspect thereby is that we wanna, as managers, we wanna create reachable, achievable, specific, so in a sense, smart goals, so that employees can particularly follow those goals and reach those results. That would be ideal. So in that aspect, on the one hand, we want to motivate people to reach a certain goal, because it's fun to be presented with a goal that you're actually able to reach. But of course, you need to first know as an employee that you are going to be able to reach. So you need a good leadership. You need managers that understand your skills as an employee, they understand your competences and give you goals that you are able to reach. And thereby we have actually a big motivational factor towards goal theories, and all the goal theories are also motivational theories, so to speak. We empower employees by giving them the responsibility of reaching particular goals. And that also, this empowerment, this shifting of responsibility is a motivational aspect of result controls. And thereby, by setting clear goals, by setting achievable and measurable goals, we not only empower and motivate people, but we clearly influence the behavior and the action of employees. And I think we ought to be aware of that by using control mechanisms like result controls, we are able to influence, I don't want to say manipulate, because we're just shifting the employees' behavior towards organizational goals. So we influence their behavior to do better, to motivate them. And that's actually a pretty cool tool of management control systems. And as this slide also gets to shows you, it's about the input, about the processes, the output. With any input, we can have results. Like we shouldn't put more, we shouldn't use more material than such. It shouldn't cost more than such. Um, those can be results. Any of the processes, the in-between steps can be results, and of course the output itself. And for sales, how much did we sell? What's the margin, and so on. If we stay on a financial aspect. So we have financial aspect, human aspects, non-financial aspects that we can consider when we talk about result controls. And Malmi and Brown, as mentioned previously, in their framework, they would cover the result controls. They would name the result controls cybernetic controls, which is in that aspect the same thing. And a good example, for example, would be the balanced scorecard. Any aspect on a balanced scorecard has to do with result controls, because whether we target the financial perspective or a customer perspective or the human, the internal processes perspective, or learning and knowledge like in a human resources perspective, any of the different perspectives a balanced scorecard may have, any of those are broken down to several indicators, several key performance indicators that are going to be measured. And even those non-financial targets are eventually, based on the balanced scorecard, measured. And therefore, it's also part of all of these measurements are part of result controls. Alrighty. That means what you measure is what you get based on Kaplan and Norton, and that's the main objective of companies in influence the behavior of employees as much so you motivate them, empower them to go exactly that direction that you want them to go towards organizational goals. Cool. Then I believe we got result controls pretty much covered. And as an important aspect of result controls, and when we talk about motivating our employees, then as already mentioned, the aspect of reward and compensation or incentive setting becomes very important. We target that phenomena also with the agency theory, the principal agency theory, and we'll get to that, I think, in session 4, right? Then we cover theories as well. But this is a perfect aspect of agency theory, for example, setting incentives. Now, as a result, we have numerous key performance indicators that management can measure. We empower employees to reach those results and be responsible for reaching those results. And now the question is the motivational effect. Are they intrinsically motivated or are they extrinsically motivated? And on the one hand, you got to figure that out in management, and on the other hand, you got to measure it as well, whether you want to influence any intrinsic motivation by setting extrinsic incentives. So we have all sorts of different incentives. Not all incentives must be monetary, and therefore, maybe if someone is intrinsically motivated, maybe you want to give them rather social incentives. or any what would be social incentives, for example, having a green fee on a golf course, for example, or having access to certain public events like cultural events, for example, getting a membership of some high class association that person wants to be part at, or something like that could be an incentive, and it won't really turn into an extrinsic motivation. However, of course, career incentives are also very important. Promotions or educating staff could be an incentive. If you reach that goal, you get further education. We pay your tuition fees of something, and you can continue, let's say, project management or environmental management or something. You can enhance your skills and competencies. Monetary incentives, obviously, institutional incentives would also be a great, or is also actually well liked, if you are as an employee suddenly part of it, in a decision-making process. This would be your reward because you're an expert in your field, you reach the results, you are empowered and you perform greatly, and suddenly you are a part of a decision-making process. This would also be part of an incentive setting in the aspect of result controls. What's important are certain characteristics that are interdependent, so to speak, namely congruence. We've already addressed that. That's an aspect of goal congruence. Any result gotta be in congruence with the organizational strategies, with the organizational goals. It gotta be controllable. Otherwise, I can't measure it. So those are also aspects of being of having smart results, smart goals, being precise, specific, a certain objectivity. We shouldn't have results that are subjective to a certain perspective, but rather objective, so they are truly objectively measurable. The timeliness, naturally, if employees don't know in what time frame they should reach the result, it may also be demotivating. Understandability, employees ought to understand and comprehend their task and the results. And cost efficiency, naturally, would be an aspect to watch. Also, the cost benefit aspect of the control mechanism. Smart goals would be the key. Okay, then the aspect of tightness in towards or with in when we use result controls, we have three parameters that we have to focus on. For result controls to be tight, we have to, or management has to clearly define what is the result, how do I achieve the result, what is in the end, how do I understand the result. So what the definition of the result, of what is expected of me, and it cannot be communicated. It doesn't make sense if management knows what they expect, but they don't communicate, or they communicated only half of it. So they gotta define the result, but they also gotta communicate it. That's the first step, so to speak, of tightness of result controls. The second step is performance measurement. Okay, I defined it, I communicated, but now I also gotta measure it, which means I gotta make sure does the employee reach the goal, or how is he or she reaching the goal? I gotta measure it, whether it worked, whether the employee reached the goal or not. And the third step of tightness is a very harsh one, is reinforcement, which means you either place incentives and reward that employee for reaching the results, or you punish. And that's the question now. Any result control should be defined and communicated clearly, but that doesn't make it yet tight. It makes it tight once you start the performance measurement, which means in a sense it's either you recalculate whether they hit all the numbers, or you observe whether all the actions were towards the goal. So you supervise, and supervision is always feels always tight. Ooh, I'm getting observed whether I hit my numbers or not. That is already a part of a tightness. Now, when you include thereafter a reinforcement to either get a bonus or get a punishment, punishment would mean you have to, it could mean all sorts of things. Either you get a deduction of pay, which would be very hefty, but it could also be that you are not allowed to have to go to social groupings or social events, or that you are excluded, almost like a social stigma perhaps. So a punishment could of course be in a lot of different ways. However, that kind of reinforcement makes it very tight. It's great if you get a bonus, but knowing that you can also be punished based on achieving a result or not makes it very, very tight. And therefore, you have to also keep in mind this tightness might be a demotivating aspect. It can be a motivating aspect for those who like it tight. And that may be strange or funny, but there are also people in the world who like to be free, and there are also people in the world who like it when their job description and when their job is rather observed and tied, which means they are supervised and they are thankful for their supervision. Those may be employees that constantly ask, hey, is that okay if I do that and that? Will that get me to my goal? These people may actually perhaps even get that bonus because they follow the rules so much and they appreciate the tightness. So you as managers, you will have to evaluate how tight do your result controls have to be for each of your employees on your staff. Some like it and need it a bit more tight, and others don't. Actually, they're demotivated by having such a tight control mechanism. All right, for you and for your exam, it is important that you understand the 3 steps of tightness, which means definition and communication, performance measurement for result controls, and thereafter the reinforcement, punishment or a bonus. Okay. At last, also result controls have positive aspects as well as negative consequences or aspects. The pros are clearly that you empower people and that's motivating, that you set goals, clearly smart goals, and that is also motivating for employees. And setting goals doesn't cost anything, almost literally. So those are pros. On the con side, naturally, if we set results that are not achievable, which means if we place a carrot, but the employee will never reach that carrot, we should be very careful with that. That may be quickly demotivating, and also a problem. Just like now, for example, we have a coronavirus having an impact in our global environment. And if we set any result controls, but that cannot be achieved at the moment because economy it's not collapsing, but it has a few gaps. Well, that would also be very demotivating and very would actually make employees insecure if they are bound to a bonus system or to a reinforcement based on uncontrollable factors. So this would also be a negative aspect, and we would have to evaluate our result controls, whether they are fair to our employees. Okay, action controls, that is the next one that I'm going to hit, and since it's already past 11:30, I'm going to move on a bit quicker. Action controls should control or target the action of our employees, which means they may behave in a way that we didn't foresee, that we didn't expect. We give them a result, we give them a goal, and they, instead of going straight for the goal by having a certain organizational process, they realized, oh, there's a gray area. Actually, it's much easier to reach that goal in a different way, and they behave in a different way. This can also be targeted via the principal agency theory. And to behave in a different way that the management did not expect. However, this may be wrong. This may actually not be suitable for an organization. This may be very short-sighted, perhaps even. Let's say the result could be we should sell vacuumers, and vacuumers have a great contribution margin, and that's why we could earn a lot of money. We should sell this year alone, we should sell 100 vacuumers. However, the goal is not to sell 100 vacuumers. The goal, the result, would be to increase sales by a certain amount or a certain percentage. Let's say by increase sales by 10%. So now the sales force, they recognize that we have the highest contribution margin, or that we have a good contribution margin with the vacuumer, but they also recognize that we have the highest contribution margin, and it's a much easier sell if we sell just the vacuumer bags, for example. And so now they're selling perhaps more bags than actual vacuumers, despite the fact which one has more contribution margin, and whether it suits their organizational goals or not. They're just selling whatever they are able to sell, and if they cannot sell as much vacuumers, then they sell all these byproducts. And despite the fact that they may reach the 10% increase in revenue, which is great, they didn't actually sell what was intended to be sold. And this may be now a weak example, but it should just show you that all of us or employees that work with a certain process, they also know their ins and outs and their gray areas, their undetectable areas, and they may use those let's say areas which management didn't even expect. And so therefore suddenly we have a wrong action which may also turn into wrong organizational goals. Right. This is something that we target with action controls, means we want to hinder employees that they act in any uncontrollable way, perhaps even thereby harming organizational processes or even the organizational image. For example, complaint management. It's a matter of how I treat complaints, how I process complaints of customers, whether customers are happy and are satisfied with our complaint management, with our organization or not. And that's not necessarily a matter of result controls, but that's a matter of action controls. How do our employees act during complaint management or in complaint management? And will we keep our customers, or will we actually lose our customers because of bad complaint management. And that may be just a matter of actions. Actions also in the aspect of how you treat people, how you treat customers, how you talk to customers, and so on. So this is something that we want to control with action controls, and we have to do so. We have four basic forms of action controls, namely behavioral constraints, means that we cannot just do any behavior. I'll get to that point later. Pre-action reviews. So a pre-action review in ahead of time, before employees even act upon something, we already review how could possibly employees act. Action accountability, making employees responsible for their actions, as well as redundancy, double checking, 4I principle, so to speak. Those four basic forms of action controls are the basic forms of action controls. And when we talk about tightness for action controls, then we have, in a sense, one arm that is designed for behavioral constraints. And behavioral constraints mean that employees are not allowed just to do anything. That can be in the aspect of administrative constraints, like needing a password to enter a computer. Then you have a constraint, but that's administrative. Without a password, you can't behave, you can't do anything. So therefore, it's a behavioral constraint. Or a physical constraint, that would mean that you would have, for example, you need a key for the office. Then you can't enter something. You can't check the inventory without having access to the warehouse. That is one aspect of tightness for action controls. Pre-action reviews are in this aspect not tight. And then the other branch goes to action accountability. And accountability in the sense making employees responsible for their action. This is also very tight and is the tightest form of action controls. And this has the same three-step idea. You got to first, as managers, you got to first define and communicate the actions that are allowed or what is not allowed, ideally both. And then you track the action, which means you measure their actions, you supervise, you observe. Is the employee following the guidelines? Is he or she staying within their guidelines? And last but not least, you also have the action reinforcement, which means good actions are rewarded and bad actions are punished. And also this punishment can be in any way. It can be socially, it can be in the aspect of restraints. You are not allowed to enter here anymore. You are not allowed, or you're not part of the decision-making process anymore. Or it's a monetary punishment, depending. Okay, that's towards tightness. We'll start with the behavioral constraint. Again, we have physical constraints. That's pretty much tight because you have locks on desks, computer passwords. Oh, sorry, I mixed it up with administrative constraints earlier. A computer password is also obviously a physical constraint because you're physically sitting in front of your laptop and wanting to enter something. So it is also a physical constraint. The administrative constraint would be if you need a signature on something. Then this is a hierarchical authority accountability, so to speak, and therefore it's an administrative constraint because you don't have the position or the allowance to, let's say, write a check of 2,000 euros because you need to have a signature of your your immediate manager who authorize that. And that would be also a constraint, for example. So behavioral constraints have two aspects: physical constraints, you cannot enter somewhere, or administrative constraints based on the hierarchical level, you would need authorization to do something. There can also be a combined constraints like a poker yokes. That would be like an autopilot at an airplane. You set the autopilot, and then you are constrained in that sense that you cannot. You would have to switch to manual flight again. The autopilot flies on his or her own, on its own, and therefore it's like an automation. So you don't have a behavioral problem if employees do not fly, but the machine flies itself. That's like a poker yokes, so to speak, making something foolproof or automate it in a sense. Okay, then pre-action review would literally mean that when you create processes in your organizations, that you ahead of time review that process and assume or interpret which kind of behavior could possibly your employees have. What could they do? What could they perform? How do they get there to as part of that process? And in that aspect, you realize, oh wow, we have a few gray areas that employees may misbehave, and you are trying in pre-action review, you're trying to cut that process ahead of time by restricting employees to do that, by setting code of conduct, by laying it out in the job description that this and this and this is not tolerated. That also gets to show the employee that you are aware of that gap, of that gray area of behavior, for example. So pre-action reviews is taking certain actions ahead of time and trying to reduce those options. Also, in this case, we could have a certain tightness, and that would be an external consultant. If an external consultant comes into the operation, into the organization, and evaluates the efficiency and the behavior of employees towards certain processes, this evaluation, they write then their report, and this is also called a tightness. And that is why employees seldom like that suddenly external consultants are coming in and reevaluating organizations and its processes. They often shut their information because they don't want to give too much information. They don't want to reveal all the gray behavioral areas of an organization. So this is also called tightness. And then we have action accountability. This is a big one. You can and should make, and especially in the aspect of action controls, you should make your employee responsible for their actions. But this is truly the tightest, because being responsible for my own actions means also that I take all the consequences when actions are wrong or when I misbehave, so to speak. So this is about taking the responsibility of certain actions away from management onto the employee themselves, which is fine. After all, they are misbehaving in a certain aspect. And for that, tightness would be defining and communicating again. And instead of performance measurement, like it would be with result controls, here it's action tracking. You observe and you track the actions of your employees. You supervise the actions of your employees. And based on that, you reward or punish. And then we have a control type, a redundancy. This is a good one. means, for example, the 4I principle, or having a couple of processes, double checking a certain process, which makes sense. It depends, of course, on a cost benefit factor, whether it does make sense or not. But let's say we have all the revenue and all the cash we got in needs to be transferred to the bank. And if one person alone is responsible for that, 100 euros may be missing easily out of the cash of the revenue, and thereafter, you know, no one knows, no one has done it, and it's very difficult perhaps to set responsibilities, and therefore a certain redundancy. Let's say that 2 people count the cash of the day of the revenue and then deposit it. Maybe also 2 people deposit the money, for example, would restrict people, would restrict employees to misbehave, to behave inappropriately, in this case perhaps to steal. And therefore redundancy is a good mechanism, a good control mechanism, to double check employees, to double check what they have put in the computer. Even computers have algorithms that they double check the processes, or that whatever has been entered during the day. So this is also a good control mechanism, so to speak, redundancy. But naturally, we also have here pros, but also cons. And the pros, the pros are that yes, action controls is the tightest form of control. It's a very direct form of control, because it affects the employee immediately. It's not just the result; it's the employee, him or herself, the action. But in this case, they have a great opportunity to learn, because their action is immediately evaluated and reflected on their as a consequence, or as a beneficial result. So there is a potential there for organizational learning, for individual learning, that's a positive. However, obviously, the negative aspect is that when you use action controls, they quickly feel a bit tight, because you observe, you supervise, you reprimand employees' actions, their behavior, and people tend to not like that so much. So that they create or build a sort of a negative attitude, that they are demotivated, that they are discouraged to continue to be creative, for example. So that's a problem. There can be a problem with action controls. It can also be that action controls may be very costly if we indeed hire an external consultant, for example, or if we indeed implement a security system, cameras or whatever, to watch, observe, and control our employees' action. This is naturally also a negative aspect. And then we have yet another in-class exercise, and in this case I would like to give that to you as an additional homework. So here we have a critical thinking, the Burj Khalifa in Dubai, and it talks about internal controls on cash receipts. This is your information, the case itself, and those are the required questions. And I like for you to take those slides and answer that case as a homework, as you just submitted via PDF or Word document via email, please. Personal controls. Personal controls, there it's all about getting the competencies to the people. Personal control is the answer of personal limitation. The problem is personal limitation. I don't have the competencies. I hired the wrong person for the wrong job. Now, what do I have to do? and personal controls will target those problems. What do I expect of my employees? What is their task? An accountant has a different task than a controller, than a salesperson, than a marketing person. So what do I actually expect of my employees, and thereby a lack of direction is important again, or not the lack of direction, but the actual giving direction is important again. I, as management manager, have to know what I expect, and therefore define and communicate, create a job description that makes sense for each position that I want to fill. So, in a sense, it's my task as manager to make sure that every employee is able to do a good job and wants to do a good job. If they have the competencies, they will also stay motivated because they are able to do a good job. But then it's about experience, it's about knowledge, about their personal skills and capabilities, about education, and I may have to help in that aspect, or I may have hired employees that already are qualified to be able to do a good job. The core principle would be that they manage to be self-monitoring, which means they have such high competencies, those employees, that they can monitor themselves. They themselves know, because hopefully intrinsically motivated, what to do in certain cases, in certain changes, in certain processes that need adjustment. They themselves know what to do because they have the competences and the skills. Therefore, ideally, obviously, management doesn't need to supervise and observe them all the time, because they are qualified and capable, competent employees. So by using personal controls, I can reduce action controls, I can focus on result controls, because we have a great staff, great employees, competent employees that are, in addition to their competencies, even self-monitoring. It would be like me. I'm an assistant in a university, research and teaching assistant for research and teaching, and my direct supervisor would be my professor, but she doesn't sit here right now, and she's not following my lecture. So I have to be very much self-monitoring. But I'm not just writing, or I'm not just teaching. I'm also researching, and I'm responsible for my dissertation. But also this part, while she is monitoring my dissertation to a certain degree, there's still a lot of time for self-monitoring, for self-guidance. So I do have to have the competencies to be able to do a good job. Otherwise, this all would be very challenging, very hard. You may even, as students, you may complain that you have a weak teacher, that the teaching competences were not quite there, that I didn't support you, or whatever. So here, for me to be able to do a good job, I need experience, knowledge, capabilities, and so on. And particularly in my job, I have to monitor myself. And ideally, that would be the same in any other organization for any position. If employees are able to monitor themselves and have the capabilities, they stay motivated, and you need less management to guide them because of their education, of their experience, of their knowledge, and so on. Great, personal controls here, but how? That's of course a question. It sounds nice, but how to do that? And basically, we have to make sure that that we have the right people in the right job. Do not take a marketing person as an accountant just because the accountant got sick, because it doesn't work in that sense. So find the right people for the right job, and also make sure to educate them for their position. Help them as much as you can that they are able to do a good job. Selection and placement in this aspect, so recruiting, find the right people, very important. Training, that can be external training or internal training, again, for them to be able to make a good job. And the job design and provision, to make sure they have everything they need, including you as a manager that helps them, that supports them, or a supervisor, and so on. So make sure they have all the necessary resources. Great. We have pros, obviously, because teaching or educating employees, supporting their paying certain educational programs, that is motivating. They exceed their own expectations by getting educated, by getting trained. They can be proud of themselves. They're part of something bigger and better. And so that's good. That also affects their own particular learning curve. So therefore, this is also a very much personal, a very much motivating aspect. And the cons, this is probably the only control that is literally very expensive. If you do not hire the right people, it's very expensive. You have a higher fluctuate, it's probably the most expensive maneuver that you have, not hiring the right people and trying to find constantly training people and hiring people. On the other hand, it can also be very costly if you need to educate all these people and train all these people. So here also you have a very big cost and benefit factor. Is it worth it to train a certain person so that he or she can do a better job? Or is it even better and less expensive if we get rid of that one person and hire another more competent person? Those are naturally questions, and that's a sort of the side effect of personal controls. And that's the literature, whatever reason that is, that this slide is here. We are not finished yet. I see, okay. We continue to enter the second homework in this case, employee motivation and leadership accountability. And this would be an in-class exercise, which we are not doing at this point. You are the future leader. How can you be a good leader? Bill is your management accountant and seems down and demotivated. So what will you do? And if I were his manager, so I'm going to answer this again for you. If I were Bill's manager, the best chance for me to realize why he is motivated is to sit down with him and ask him. But I must be aware of the fact that I'm his supervisor or his manager. He may not tell me everything. So therefore, I have a very big issue that I need to cover first, and that is trust. Bill needs to first learn to trust me as his manager, that I will support him, that I will be there for him, that I will listen, and that we will find together the best solution so that he can work again and that he can be motivated. That demotivation aspect may be due to that he doesn't have the skill as a management accountant, that he is overwhelmed and he doesn't really, that he needs actually training and education to do a better job. So maybe that personal limitation may be a part of a demotivation. Another part of demotivation may be just some private aspects. Maybe it doesn't work with his wife or his girlfriend or his family atmosphere. Maybe something else happened. Maybe he's actually sick or whatever. This could be a private dilemma that demotivates him. And naturally, it can also be lack of direction, that whatever the direction he gets, in this case from me as his manager, that this may be demotivating because I'm not having smart goals, they are not clear, he's not really sure how to achieve those, or he seems maybe he thinks they're unrealistic. So those are different aspects, again, within those three categories of main problems that could be why Bill is demotivated. And now, as a manager, I cannot do anything better but try to find the answer. Why is he actually demotivated? And if it's indeed something like the goals, Bill may not never tell me that his goals are very fuzzy and not very specific. So sometimes maybe also in this aspect I would need to help him. Like, could it be that you don't understand the goals, or are you, or could you repeat the goals so I can make sure that you actually understand what is expected of you? Something like that is it's of course not an easy task, but leadership has never been easy. The question is, how do we recognize that we have a problem, a situation, and how do we go about with that problem? And based on management control systems, we now have to find whether we have a result control issue, an action control issue, a personal control issue, or perhaps, and we'll get to that now, a cultural control issue. So I hope this in-class exercise made sense to you. I hope I explained that. It makes a bit more sense. Individual and group appreciation, support and training, getting skills, autonomy, empowerment. We've talked about that already. Task identification, purpose, involvement. Task identification, purpose, involvement, those are why questions. Those give the employee reason, the purpose. Trust, as I mentioned, is important, and humor and fun never hurts. Okay, and then we come to cultural controls. And I'm going to use the next 5 minutes to explain culture, or 6 minutes to explain the cultural controls, and then we'll get to the very last homework that I would like to also present to you today. So cultural controls are, as we already mentioned, has to do with the organizational culture. Therefore, which culture do we live? What's our atmosphere? How do we treat our peers, our organizational members? How do we get along, not only as individuals, but also as departments, for example? How do we work together? Therefore, we target our traditions. What's important to us? What are our values? What are our norms, the beliefs, the ideologies behind that, which also affects naturally our attitudes, our management attitudes. How do we perform things? How do we think? In which light, in which perspective do we think? In a sense of wearing a uniform, of having a symbol, symbols like a brand name or an organizational brand. Like there's a difference whether I work for Nike or for Google or for Amazon or whatever. Those are all different identifications, different symbols, so to speak. And therefore, not just attitudes, but also a way of behaving. And this is governed within cultural controls. And yes, while cultural controls are the hardest controls to control, because once organizational culture is established, it's very hard to change. If you have new hires and new employees, so to speak, or new management coming in, they often recognize the downsides of a certain culture and they want to change things. And those are the first ones that recognize how hard it is to change something, because we've always done it that way. No, it doesn't work like that, not here, not in our company, and so on. Because of traditions, of norms, of ideologies, of attitudes. So this is a very hard control that we can alter, that we can adjust. But, and here we have Simmons levels of control that help us enormously, for example, in changing also cultural controls by using, through the belief system, so to speak, by using the interactive control system. And that interactive control system, due to the interaction, this must not, or is probably not as formal, but rather informal. They communicate a lot, and through communication, through creating new beliefs, a new dynamic, you may alter an entire organizational culture because of interactive control mechanisms. And that's why this is also predestined more or less for a changing environment. In that aspect, you can adjust cultural controls. One aspect of cultural controls naturally is also codes of conduct, which means how are employees or how is management expected to behave? What are our codes, our guidelines, so to speak? And this could be a part of integrity, loyalty, objectivity, naturally, confidentiality. The competencies themselves could be a part of codes of conduct. Honesty could also be a code of conduct or a part. This would all have to be defined. And what does it mean, integrity? What does it mean, honesty, transparency, for example? But some companies also have, as a part of a conduct, their health programs and their assurances or insurances, for example. So this could also be part of organizational values or virtues, so to speak. The codes of conduct. Another and in addition, a code of conduct would be a very formal cultural control mechanism, because a code of conduct would be written out, it would be posted somewhere, maybe even on a homepage. And ideally, it would include or involve the vision of a company, a mission statement, the strategies, what is it all about. And the code of conduct guides the behavior of employees towards our overall mission, for example. One way of adjusting or controlling that culture is also group-based rewards. It means if I don't just reward every single person for achieving their results, for having a good performance and so on, but if I reward certain groups, there could be a whole department, but it could also be more than just one department. It could be interlinked with different departments. We reward the marketing, controlling, and the purchasing department if they manage to cut their costs while still purchasing would have to cut their costs, controlling would analyze whether they manage to cut their costs, and marketing, on the other hand, is obviously on the edge of spending money. So while they are cutting costs, marketing has the same amount of costs that purchasing just saved, and they spend it in a valuable marketing campaign. Controlling is governing the whole thing. So it could be that those three departments, for example, work together. And if they manage, the closer they come to ideal results based on clear, smart result controls, it could be a group-based reward. And if you do that, you actually change the dynamic within a whole organization, not just within a department or within a team or a project team, but perhaps throughout an organization. So in this case, like group-based rewards could actually be a powerful cultural changer, so to speak. What could also affect cultural controls or can be used as cultural controls is to remodel your organization, your offices, for example. Open door policy has a cultural aspect, putting plans, office plans, having a dress code, having uniforms, having slogans, having symbols. And if you change a symbol to another symbol, there will be another meaning with another symbol. And therefore you can change culture by changing symbols, by changing a dress code, by rearranging departments, offices, perhaps even entire organizations. So those are ways where you can influence culture that actually affects the organization at last. Yes, we also have pros and cons in that aspect, namely pros that all the whys, the purpose, the reason why I work, my task identification, the identification with the organization, you can answer those questions with cultural controls. You can give any employee the purpose of being there, of working so hard and so on through cultural controls. So, and especially in a changing environment, to not underestimate the power of cultural controls. But needless to say, and as a con, obviously, it's the most difficult to change as well. You will have to be really creative to be able to change that culture, and you really have to use interactive controls or control mechanisms to be able to change a culture from the bottom level of employees all the way to the top management. After all, it gotta be lived. There is a belief system that's governing the culture that needs to be changed. Right. So that's probably the biggest con is the difficulty of changing that. This is one last slide that shows the lack of direction, the motivational problems or lack of motivation and the personal limitation, and how it affects personal controls and cultural controls. And we see that we have a lot of lack of direction, naturally also personal limitation, and that especially within personal controls and cultural controls, it's hardly ever any motivational issue based on Merchant and van der Stede. Okay, I guess this was the last slide on course content. How